Welcome back to the Creating a Community Animal Disaster Plan Toolkit. Let's move on to step 3. Understand the risks and hazards in your community. How do you identify the risks and hazards for your community? It's relatively easy to start. If you're a community in the Rocky Mountain West, your hurricane hazard may be almost non-existent, but your wildfire hazard may be very high. Generally speaking, it's easy to identify weather or other naturally caused hazards in your area. But consider that you may have other kinds of hazards as well. You may have the possibility of a dam or levee failure that could cause dangerous flooding, or you may have an interstate highway system with trucks transporting hazardous materials through your community. There are also the hazards that are human caused, such as terrorist acts, or even large scale animal hoarders, which we'll examine more closely a little bit later. How do you identify your risks and hazards in advance? First, look through historical documentation. Perhaps you haven't had earthquakes in your area in recent memory, but your community's historical records might indicate that when an earthquake did occur 150 years ago, it was very severe. Other more recent events are also documented, and you can take that information and use it in working through the hazards and risks in your plan. Research where you have concentrations of animals that might be vulnerable, like animal boarding businesses, breeding facilities, or large-scale hoarding situations. Determine what your overall pet population is for your community. Do you need to plan for 200 animals or do you need to plan for 2,000 animals? Let's examine this exercise of determining your community's pet population in a little more detail. Step 3 of the Toolkit manual walks you through a high-level methodology of finding your community's overall pet population. In our webinar today, let's look at Anytown, Colorado. First, I locate U.S. Census data to determine how many households are in any town, and I find that my community has 4,383 households. I then determine how many pets are in each household, on average, by using the American Veterinary Medical Association's Pet Ownership Calculator. I combine the total I get for each species to get a grand total of 5,847 possible animals in any town. But keep in mind that the AVMA calculator uses national averages for its calculations. So I know that I have to use my local knowledge to adjust accordingly. In this example, I know that any town is a largely suburban community with very low ownership of horses. So I'll adjust my horse total population down by 75%, which leaves me with only about 45 horses to be concerned with. That leaves me with a total animal population of 5,712 to plan for. Of course, many of my potential pet owning evacuees will find emergency sheltering for themselves and their pets with local pet friendly hotels, friends, or family. But if only 20% of my total estimated animals need emergency animal sheltering, I still need to plan for the possibility of sheltering 1,142 animals. If the disaster that hits my community causes only 20% of my households to evacuate, and I find that I need to shelter only 20% of those animals, my planning number goes down drastically. But it is still several hundred pets that I need to be prepared to shelter. You and your planning partners may need to apply this pet population formula in a variety of configurations to understand all the possible populations of pets you might need to plan for. But this general formula will give you a basic tool to work with. And if you'll refer back to the toolkit, you'll find information on how to obtain data that can help you tailor these exercises based on your own state-specific averages. Finally, let's talk about exotic animals as a risk in your community. When we think of household pets, we tend to think of dogs, cats, and perhaps even horses and goats. But there are significant numbers of households in any given community who keep non-traditional or what are commonly called exotic animals or pets. These can include small, medium, and large reptiles and snakes, exotic birds like parrots or cockatoos, and small mammals like ferrets or sugar gliders. Many of these exotic pets are fragile and cannot go into your emergency animal shelter. They are temperature sensitive and require specialized food and handling. Determine ahead of time where you can safely house, care, and feed temperature and food sensitive reptiles and birds. Exotic animals can also unexpectedly include large animals like lions and tigers. For instance, during Hurricane Ike in 2008, a resident who owned a fully mature lion and a tiger attempted to evacuate from the hurricane. Finding himself unable to continue, he sought an emergency refuge for his two large felines in the sanctuary of a local church. And you'll see a picture of that on the slide in front of you. These two large felines remained in the church until well into the recovery period after the hurricane. The moral of the story? People have unexpected animals in their homes and backyards. Think about these as potential risks and hazards in your animal disaster planning. Animal hoarders in your community often run below the radar. If they limit the public's view of their animals, and if no one has a reason to file a complaint against them, they can exist for years without coming to the surface. But the surest way of driving them out of cover is a natural disaster that forces them to evacuate with their animals. Consider that in 2010, the animal response team in Memphis, Tennessee, suddenly found themselves asked to evacuate 70 dogs from an animal hoarding situation that was quickly being flooded by rising waters. These 70 dogs turned out to be semi-feral, with little or no human socialization, aggressive to people, and completely unvaccinated for diseases. The animal response team had to move quickly to quarantine these 70 dogs from the 72 family-owned pets who were already being sheltered in the emergency shelter. Because these hoarding situation dogs were completely unsocialized, the team that handled them had to be expert dog handlers, familiar with handling aggressive dogs. To make the situation even worse, within days, these difficult dogs were breaking out with distemper and parvo, and the large animal sheltering team now also had a large animal disease disaster to manage and deal with. To manage the situation, the team required a large facility that could be completely quarantined, a team of trained aggressive dog handlers, a team of veterinarians and veterinary technicians to manage the quarantine and the treatment of dogs, large quantities of level 4 personal protective equipment, large amounts of disinfectant and cleaning supplies, and unfortunately, in the end, large amounts of euthanasia supplies. Most animal disaster plans do not prepare their communities for this kind of challenge. What initially was a larger than normal request for evacuation assistance turned out to be a disaster within a disaster. Knowing your community and identifying all possible threats and risks will help you plan in advance of the disaster happening. You can't plan for everything, of course, but even talking through the possible scenarios with your planning team will help you identify broad areas where your advanced planning can make a difference. Any facility in your community that concentrates large quantities of animals should be documented and factored into your plan. Many will be legitimate facilities that have their own animal disaster plans and capabilities. Understanding who they are and what their plans are will help you understand whether your plan needs to intersect with theirs. Unfortunately, many large concentrations of animals will be in what are essentially illegal facilities who don't present themselves publicly. They will most likely not have an evacuation or sheltering plan, and they may be a nexus for animal disease spread if they evacuate into the larger community. They can present large challenges for your community in a disaster. How do you find them and understand the risks they present? It's difficult, but if anyone in your community knows about them, it will be the animal stakeholders that you have invited into your planning process. So let's recap. Your community is vulnerable to a number of risks and hazards, such as floods, fires, or other natural disasters. You have a number of sources that can help you find current as well as historical data on disasters that may have future impacts on your community. A few relatively simple calculations can give you an overall estimate of how many animals in your community might be affected by a disaster event. Remember that you may have additional issues to think about in terms of planning for exotic pets, large animal sanctuaries, or cases of hoarding or cruelty that may arise during a disaster.